In the humid summer of 1905, deep within the folds of Japan's shifting history, an event took place that would be spoken of only in hushed whispers, surviving more in rumor than in official record. It began, as so many of the darkest tales do, under the cover of night. A remote mountain shrine, abandoned and forgotten by most, flickered with candlelight that cast dancing shadows across the walls. 13 figures, cloaked in ceremonial robes, sat in a circle, their faces obscured, their voices blending into a low, guttural chant. The words were old, archaic Japanese, carrying the weight of centuries of suppressed knowledge. As the rhythm of their voices grew, as incense smoke thickened into an almost suffocating fog, something intangible seemed to shift in the room. Those who claimed to know of the ritual would later say that, on that night, a door was opened, one not meant for human hands to touch. And what came through was not salvation, but madness. The year 1905 was a pivotal moment for Japan. The nation had just astonished the world by defeating Russia in a war that announced its arrival as a modern empire. The Meiji era was marked by rapid modernization, the blending of Western technology and institutions with deeply rooted cultural traditions. In the bustling cities of Tokyo and Osaka, gas lamps burned, railways expanded, and Western clothing became a fashionable statement. Yet, away from the light of progress, in the rural corners and forgotten temples of the countryside, older beliefs still clung stubbornly to life. There, the veil between the modern and the ancient seemed paper-thin. Old gods, restless spirits, and forbidden knowledge were not relics of folklore. They were living forces, waiting for those foolish or desperate enough to call upon them. It is in this fragile, shifting landscape that the story of the ritual begins. Some say the men who gathered that night were patriots, believing that by invoking forgotten spiritual powers they could secure Japan's strength against the West. Others argue they were outcasts, men who felt alienated by modernization, clinging to mysticism as a last desperate grasp for control. Whatever their true motives, what unites the accounts is chilling. They sought to transcend the limits of the human mind and touch something beyond. They sought to awaken powers that legend claimed were older than the islands of Japan themselves. But there is a reason such rituals survive only in fragmented texts and whispered warnings. Stories passed down through generations speak of a gate of madness, a ritual act said to tear the thin fabric separating our world from one of chaos and shadow. Those who dared perform it might glimpse truths too vast for human comprehension, and pay the price with their sanity. This was not a prayer for blessings, nor a festival to honor ancestors. This was an experiment with the forbidden, a deliberate attempt to rip open the unseen. And when that door cracked open, the cost was far greater than anyone could have imagined. The aftermath of that single night would ripple outward like a stain spreading through water. Some participants were found screaming uncontrollably, their eyes wide as if beholding something no one else could see. Others were reduced to lifeless shells, catatonic, unable to speak or even recognize their own families. At least one was discovered dead by his own hand, his body surrounded by indecipherable symbols scrawled in blood. Local villagers, frightened and superstitious, whispered of cursed shadows roaming the mountains. The authorities who came later confiscated what they could, scrolls, talismans, and notes, but they could not confiscate the stories, nor erase the fear that lingered long after. This documentary will guide you through that forgotten history. We will explore who these men were, what forces they thought they were summoning, and why they believed such a terrible ritual was worth the risk. We will uncover the cultural crossroads Japan stood upon in 1905, when the nation wrestled with its identity between modern progress and ancient tradition. And we will trace the terrifying aftermath, the descent into madness, the institutional cover-up, and the unsettling question of whether something truly supernatural was unleashed that night, or whether the horror lay entirely in the human mind itself. The story you are about to hear is not widely known. It does not appear in most history books, and the few scattered references to it are buried in academic footnotes, folklore archives, and medical reports of unexplained insanity cases from the early 20th century. Yet, piece the fragments together, and a chilling picture emerges, one of ritual obsession, cultural conflict, and the eternal human temptation to seek knowledge that should remain hidden. As we step deeper into this investigation, you may find yourself wondering where the line truly lies. Were these men victims of superstition and self-delusion, unraveling under the weight of their own psychological experiments? Or did they, in fact, open a door that was meant to stay shut, glimpsing something no mind can endure? Tonight, we descend into the heart of that mystery. Tonight, we revisit the ritual that opened a door to madness. To understand the ritual that unfolded in 1905, we must first step back into the world in which it occurred. Japan at the dawn of the 20th century was a nation in flux, a country caught in the violent tension between tradition and transformation. Only a few decades earlier, Japan had been a feudal society, closed to much of the outside world, its shoguns ruling over samurai, peasants, and merchants in a rigid hierarchy. But the arrival of Western powers in the mid-19th century had forced open the nation's gates. By 1905, Japan had reinvented itself as a modern empire. Its victory in the Russo-Japanese War stunned the world, marking the first time an Asian power had defeated a European empire in modern warfare. Japan's leaders declared this victory proof of progress, proof of destiny. But beneath this triumph lay unease, uncertainty, and a nation haunted by the shadows of its past. In the great cities, modernization was visible everywhere. Tokyo's streets buzzed with trolleys, gas lamps illuminated once darkened neighborhoods, and Western suits replaced the flowing robes of traditional Japan. Schools taught German science, English literature, and the laws of modern economics. Newspapers hailed industrial growth and international recognition. Yet for every corner of the country touched by progress, there were countless others left behind. In rural provinces, where rice paddies stretched endlessly and mountain temples stood in silence, life had not changed so drastically. Superstitions persisted, spirits were feared, and folk rituals remained part of daily survival. This divide between the modern and the ancient was more than economic. It was spiritual, psychological, and deeply cultural. At the heart of this divide was the uneasy coexistence of Shinto, Buddhism, and imported Western rationalism. Shinto, the indigenous belief system of Japan, tied the living world to invisible forces, spirits inhabiting rivers, mountains, and forests. It taught reverence for the unseen, for purity, for rituals that maintain balance. Buddhism, imported centuries earlier, brought complex cosmologies, cycles of rebirth, and esoteric practices meant to transcend human suffering. For many Japanese, these two traditions intertwined, guiding festivals, family ceremonies, and village life. But with the arrival of Western science, medicine, and Christianity, doubt began to creep in. Could the spirits of the mountains still hold power in an age of railroads and factories? Could old rituals compete with microscopes and military academies? The ruling government of the Meiji era encouraged modernization but also feared the uncontrollable influence of certain religious movements. Some Buddhist sects were suppressed, their temples burned or abandoned, their libraries of sacred texts scattered. At the same time, Shinto was reshaped into a tool of nationalism, emphasizing emperor worship and divine destiny. Yet, outside official state control, smaller groups emerged, blending fragments of tradition, nationalism, and mysticism. These underground societies, often secretive, thrived on the anxiety of the age. For people who felt alienated by the pace of modernization, or betrayed by the loss of older ways, secret societies offered belonging and answers. It was within this environment that whispers of forbidden rituals gained traction. In the countryside, tales of mountain ascetics, known as yamabushi, persisted. These men practiced shugendo, a grueling fusion of Shinto and esoteric Buddhism, performing acts of self-mortification, fasting, firewalking, and prolonged meditation in caves. They were said to cross into realms where spirits and demons lingered, gaining knowledge at the cost of their sanity. Such stories filtered into the imaginations of secret societies forming in the shadows of Japan's modernization. To men dissatisfied with the modern age, the practices of the yamabushi and the old mystics seemed like a way to tap into something eternal, something that Western science could never touch. But there was also another layer, the political one. In the years leading up to 1905, nationalist groups were on the rise. Societies like the Genyosha, the Black Ocean Society, mixed patriotism with underworld dealings, pushing agendas through covert operations and violence. Many believed that to secure Japan's strength, spiritual power was as necessary as political might. This intersection of politics and the occult created a fertile ground for groups like the one that performed the infamous ritual. Their ceremonies were not just spiritual experiments, they were statements of defiance, claiming to wield forces older and more powerful than the modern state itself. At the same time, medical science in Japan was taking its first fragile steps into psychiatry. Influenced by German and French models, Japanese doctors began documenting cases of hysteria, madness, and possession. They tried to reframe supernatural afflictions as diseases of the mind. Yet in villages, a person who screamed at shadows or convulsed uncontrollably was still often thought to be under the grip of spirits. This tension between medical explanation and supernatural fear meant that when strange behaviors erupted, they could easily be interpreted in more than one way. It is within this very tension that the 1905 ritual must be understood. By 1905, Japan stood at a crossroads, a nation victorious in war, admired abroad, yet internally fractured between new science and old faith. It was a time when factories rose alongside shrines, and Western books circulated beside ghost stories. Into this fragile cultural ecosystem stepped those who would attempt to fuse the two, seeking to harness the supernatural with the discipline of ritual, believing they could bend it to their will. The men who gathered that summer in Kyoto did not see themselves as heretics. To them, they were heirs to ancient knowledge, warriors of the unseen, and guardians of Japan's hidden power. But history shows us something else entirely. The society that emerged was not remembered for strength, but for horror. Their attempt to draw power from the old ways would instead plunge them into chaos, their ceremony becoming a grotesque collision of modernization and mysticism. What they sought as a path to purity and enlightenment would instead become a descent into the abyss. And the madness that followed would reveal just how thin the veil between tradition and terror truly was. Hidden beneath the surface of Japan's triumph in 1905, away from the parades and patriotic speeches, there were groups that did not celebrate modernization as unconditionally as the government wanted. Among them was a society so secretive that its true name remains disputed. Some sources call it Kurozukai, the Black Clan, while others suggest titles that translate to the Circle of the Hidden Sun or the Brotherhood of the Shadow. What unites these references is the suggestion that this group believed they were custodians of something ancient, something that had survived centuries of suppression and change. Their rituals, whispered in fragments, were said to connect them not only to Japan's past, but to powers beyond the comprehension of ordinary men. The origins of the society are obscured, as secret histories often are. Some accounts suggest that its core members were disillusioned veterans of the Russo-Japanese War. These men, having witnessed the brutality of Industriali's combat, returned to a homeland celebrating victory yet felt spiritually hollow. Others describe its ranks as containing scholars and monks displaced during the Meiji government's dismantling of Buddhist institutions. Still others speak of descendants of samurai families stripped of status when the old feudal order collapsed. What bound them together was not class or occupation, but alienation, men who felt cast aside by modernization, hungry for a sense of belonging, and convinced that true strength did not lie in railroads or cannons, but in unlocking forces buried beneath Japan's soil and memory. The Kurozukai did not recruit publicly. There were no flyers, no open gatherings, no written oaths. Membership spread through whispers, introductions made in tea houses late at night, or in the hushed corridors of Kyoto's aging temples. To outsiders, it may have resembled a brotherhood or a study group, men gathering to drink, to debate history, to share grievances about the changes sweeping their nation. But once accepted, initiates were exposed to symbols, texts, and practices that hinted at darker purposes. Meetings were said to begin with the extinguishing of all light, followed by a moment of silence so profound that recruits often reported hearing their own hearts pounding in their ears. The silence would be broken by chants, low, deliberate recitations of words whose meaning was deliberately left obscure until later stages of initiation. The group's beliefs were not a simple revival of Shinto or Buddhism. Instead, they wove together fragments from multiple traditions, creating a tapestry of mysticism that was both uniquely Japanese and disturbingly syncretic. Shinto purification rites were blended with Buddhist mantras, but the society also borrowed elements from Onmyodo, the esoteric cosmology that involved astrology, geomancy, and the balancing of yin and yang energies. There are even claims, though impossible to prove, that members had access to Chinese occult texts smuggled into Japan centuries earlier, which spoke of summoning forces not as deities, but as entities inhabiting parallel realms. At the heart of their philosophy was the idea of awakening. Japan's modernization, they argued, was a shallow mimicry of Western science. True power could only be gained by looking inward, by accessing the hidden forces that had always been present in the land and the people. They saw themselves as guardians of these forces, chosen to reawaken what had been silenced. In their rhetoric, Japan's victory over Russia was not the result of steel and strategy but of destiny, and destiny, they believed, demanded ritual confirmation. To fail to acknowledge the spirits was to risk losing everything that made Japan more than just another nation. The society was organized in concentric circles of secrecy. Outer members performed simple rites, purification with salt, fasting before meetings, recitations of nationalist poetry. Inner members, however, were exposed to rituals far more intense. Blood offerings, mirror-gazing ceremonies, and extended isolation meant to induce altered states of mind. It was said that the higher one climbed in the society, the more reality itself began to fray, as visions, dreams, and hallucinations were encouraged as proof of progress. To some, this may sound like manipulation or madness. To those within, it was evidence that they were moving closer to the gate. Symbols played a central role in their practices. Surviving sketches, if they are authentic, show talismans inscribed with twisted versions of Shinto karma names, the characters deliberately distorted into shapes that appear almost serpentine. A recurring image was that of the black sun, encircled by waves, interpreted by some as a metaphor for enlightenment hidden in darkness, and by others as a warning of consuming madness. Members carved these symbols into wooden amulets they carried, believing them to be both protection and key. The society also developed its own mythology about a being referred to only as Kyojin no Kami, the god of madness. According to the fragments that survive, this figure was not worshipped in the way one would worship a benevolent kami. Rather, it was invoked as a threshold guardian, a force that tested those who sought forbidden knowledge. To face this god was to risk losing one's mind, but to survive the encounter was to gain clarity and strength beyond ordinary limits. This duality, between enlightenment and insanity, was central to their vision. They believed that Japan itself, caught between tradition and modernization, was facing its own trial of madness. Their ritual, then, was meant not only as a private initiation but as a symbolic act for the nation. There were rumors of their gatherings long before the infamous ritual of 1905. Villagers spoke of men chanting in the forest at night, of drums echoing through valleys, of strange fires glowing on the mountainside. Some claimed animals were found mutilated, their blood drained, talismans nailed into nearby trees. These accounts were dismissed by officials as superstition, but they spread unease among those who lived closest to the society's haunts. The name Kurozukai became associated not just with secrecy, but with danger. By the time the group prepared for their fateful ritual, their beliefs had hardened into a kind of apocalyptic urgency. They were convinced that modern Japan was spiritually hollow, that railways and factories had created a soulless machine rather than a nation. To restore balance, they believed they must open the hidden gate and allow forces of chaos to purge weakness. It was not enough to worship the past, they had to summon it, embody it, and unleash it. The ritual was to be both initiation and sacrifice, a demonstration of their willingness to suffer in pursuit of knowledge and power. The men who gathered at the abandoned shrine that summer did not see themselves as cultists or madmen. In their own minds, they were patriots, visionaries, the last heirs of a tradition that stretched back through centuries of forgotten monks and outlawed mystics. Yet history would remember them differently. Their secrecy, their symbols, their obsession with madness, all of it led to a night that would destroy their brotherhood and stain their memory with horror. The secret society had emerged from shadows of alienation and ambition. But in its attempt to grasp the eternal, it would instead stumble into chaos. Their ritual, as we will soon see, did not open the gate to enlightenment. It opened something far darker. To grasp why the secret society placed such absolute faith in their ritual, we must turn to the fractured origins of the ceremony itself. Unlike the neatly recorded histories of Shinto shrines or the carefully preserved sutras of Buddhist monasteries, the texts that inspired the 1905 ritual survive only in fragments, shreds of parchment, oral stories, and whispered references in folklore archives. Together, they point to something that never existed as a mainstream tradition, but rather as a hidden current running beneath Japan's spiritual history, a set of practices considered too dangerous, too unstable, and too blasphemous to be taught openly. The first clue comes from the Buddhist purges of the mid-19th century, when the Meiji government, seeking to elevate Shinto as the national religion, ordered the destruction of countless Buddhist temples and texts. In this climate of suppression, some monks salvaged fragments of scripture and ritual manuals before their monasteries were burned. It is believed that members of the secret society gained access to some of these fragments decades later. Scrolls charred at the edges, their ink faded, but still legible enough to suggest unorthodox practices. These scrolls hinted at invocations not of the Buddha's compassion, but of wrathful deities meant to terrify, subdue, and test the devotee. Among the names preserved in these texts was one rarely seen elsewhere, Kyojin no Kami, translated roughly as the god of madness. Parallel to this were the oral traditions of Shugendo, the mountain ascetics who lived in isolation, blending Shinto, Buddhism, and folk shamanism into a grueling spiritual practice. These men were said to fast until delirium, chant until their voices cracked, and exposed themselves to the extremes of fire and ice. Travelers whispered of ascetics who returned from the mountains not enlightened, but broken, their eyes unfocused, their words fragmented. To villagers, they were both feared and respected, men who had touched the unseen but paid the price with their sanity. One Shugendo tale speaks of a mirror hidden deep in a mountain cave, where a practitioner could see not his reflection but the truth beneath the skin of the world. Many who gazed upon it were said to lose their minds. Whether this mirror ever existed physically or was symbolic, its echoes can be felt in the society's later use of a blackened mirror in their 1905 ritual. Another thread leads to Onmyodo, the ancient cosmology that combined elements of Taoism, astrology, and divination. Practitioners, known as Onmyoji, were once employed by emperors to interpret celestial signs, protect the court from malevolent spirits, and balance the unseen forces of yin and yang. Though officially outlawed by the Meiji reforms, remnants of their teachings survived in private collections and folklore. Some surviving incantations speak of thin places in reality, where the boundaries between this world and others could be crossed. The Kurozukai's references to the gate suggest they believe such a crossing could be deliberately induced, not simply stumbled upon by chance. But the society's ritual was not simply a preservation of these traditions. It was a deliberate fusion. They took the wrathful Buddhist imagery of Kyojin no Kami, combined it with Shugendo's emphasis on physical and mental extremity, and wove it together with the cosmological calculations of Onmyodo. Out of these disparate parts, they created something wholly new, an amalgam designed not for harmony, but for confrontation with the abyss. The ritual was not a prayer, nor an offering for blessings. It was a challenge, a dare to the unseen world to reveal itself, regardless of the cost. Some accounts suggest the society also experimented with herbal preparations, bitter teas brewed from hallucinogenic plants known to induce visions. Datura, with its reputation for delirium and madness, appears in some medical notes from the time as a possible ingredient. Mushrooms of the Amanita genus, long associated with shamanic practices in other cultures, were also rumored to grow in the regions where the society operated. If these were indeed ingested, then the ritual combined not only chanting and symbolism, but chemical catalysts capable of pushing the human mind into terrifying, otherworldly states. The texts they drew upon also contained warnings. One fragment, translated awkwardly into modern Japanese, cautions, "The mirror is a gate, but not all who pass shall return. Many will see only fragments and be torn apart by them." Another states, "The God is not to be prayed to, for he gives no blessings. He is a trial, and those who fail him fall into darkness without end." These lines, rather than discouraging the society, appear to have enthralled them. The danger was not a deterrent, it was the very point. They believed that by risking madness, they proved their devotion and their worth. We can also look at the broader cultural landscape of the time. Japan in 1905 was filled with nationalist rhetoric about purification and renewal. For some, modernization meant abandoning foreign influences and reclaiming the purity of Japan's spiritual roots. The society seems to have internalized this rhetoric in a twisted form. They spoke not of purifying the nation through politics or military strength, but through spiritual ordeal. To open the gate was, in their minds, to purge weakness, first in themselves, and perhaps eventually in the entire nation. It is chilling to consider how a group of educated men, veterans, scholars, monks, could convince themselves that madness was not failure but initiation. Yet this is the recurring pattern of dangerous ritual traditions throughout history, the idea that only by breaking the mind can one truly awaken. Whether in cults, military hazing, or esoteric orders, the same principle emerges, suffering as a doorway to transformation. The society simply took this principle to an extreme, clothing it in ancient texts and nationalistic fervor. By the time they gathered in the mountain shrine, the ritual they prepared was already heavy with centuries of superstition, fragments of forbidden knowledge, and deliberate distortions of tradition. It was not the product of one religion, one culture, or one text, but a hybrid born of desperation and obsession. To its practitioners, it promised revelation. To history, it would become a story of horror. What is most unsettling is that the ritual was never meant as a one-time event. Surviving notes suggest that the 1905 gathering was intended to be the first in a series of initiations, each more intense than the last, designed to bring members step by step closer to the ultimate confrontation with Kyojin no Kami. But that first night would prove too much. The gate they tried to open demanded more than they could give. And in the silence that followed, what seeped through was not enlightenment, but madness. The origins of the ritual reveal why it was doomed from the start, a foundation built on fragments of danger, warnings reinterpreted as promises, and a belief that sanity itself was a weakness to be cast aside. The men of the Kurozukai thought themselves heirs to ancient power. Instead, they had inherited a curse disguised as knowledge. And when they dared to perform it in full, they stepped across a threshold from which there was no safe return. The shrine stood silent against the jagged outline of the mountains, its wooden beams blackened with age, its roof heavy with moss. By day it looked abandoned, another forgotten relic among countless others scattered across the countryside. But on the night of the ritual, the shrine transformed into a stage for something far more sinister. The men of the Kurozukai, their faces marked with a tension that was half faith, half terror, assembled at the threshold as twilight bled into night. The air was sharp with winter's bite, carrying with it the smell of wet pine and frozen earth. A pale moon hung low, veiled by shifting clouds, while the surrounding forest seemed to lean in, listening. The members arrived in silence, wrapped in dark robes that concealed their individual identities, but beneath the cloth their eyes glimmered with anticipation. Some had walked for days to be there, their feet blistered, their bodies gaunt from fasting. Others were scholars who had spent weeks poring over fractured texts, memorizing incantations that had never before been spoken aloud in unison. Soldiers and veterans stood among them too, men who had seen battlefields drenched in blood, yet seemed more uneasy in that moment than they ever had with a rifle in their hands. Inside the shrine, preparations had already been made. At the center of the tatami floor lay the blackened mirror, its surface so dark it seemed to swallow the faint glow of the lanterns around it. 4 thick candles had been placed at cardinal points, their flames trembling, casting monstrous shadows across the walls. Near the altar, bundles of dried herbs smoldered in a clay bowl, releasing smoke so acrid it made the eyes water. The bitter, earthy scent suggested something more than mere incense, an herbal concoction designed to cloud the senses, to open the mind to whatever lay beyond. At the front of the gathering stood the officiant, a man whose name has been lost to history but whose presence seemed to dominate the chamber. His voice carried authority, and when he began to chant, the others joined him, the sound rising like a tide. The chant was harsh, syllables jagged, as though human tongues were never meant to form them. Some phrases had been lifted from Buddhist sutras but twisted, others borrowed from Onmyodo cosmology, others still invented by the society itself. The result was not harmony but dissonance, a sound both mesmerizing and unnerving. The ritual demanded endurance. 4 hours, they chanted in unbroken rhythm, their voices merging into a drone that reverberated through the wooden beams of the shrine. Some swayed, overcome by exhaustion, but others pressed on with zeal, their eyes shut tight, lips moving as if in a trance. At intervals, the officiant struck a drum, its deep boom reverberating like a heartbeat. With each strike, the chanting grew louder, as if the sound itself were a bridge being built towards something unseen. Then came the offering of blood. One by one, members stepped forward, pricked their fingers with a ceremonial blade, and let the drops fall onto the mirror surface. The black glass seemed to absorb the crimson instantly, leaving no trace. When the final drop fell, a strange hush descended, broken only by the crackling of the herbs. The officiant raised his hands, and the chanting shifted into a higher pitch, urgent, almost frenzied. It was then that the first signs of change appeared. Witness accounts suggest that the smoke no longer drifted aimlessly but moved with purpose, curling toward the mirror as if drawn by an unseen current. The surface of the glass began to shimmer, not with light but with an unsettling distortion, like heat waves rising from asphalt. Some claimed to see faces forming within the blackness, familiar yet twisted, mouths stretched in silent screams. Others reported that the mirror seemed to deepen, as though it were no longer a surface but an opening into endless night. The reactions of the participants varied. Some fell to their knees in awe, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. Others trembled violently, their eyes wide with terror, lips bitten until blood stained their chins. One man screamed and tried to flee, but the officiant's command halted him, forcing him back into the circle. Whatever they had summoned, it was too late to retreat. Time within the shrine seemed to distort. Minutes stretched like hours, or perhaps hours collapsed into moments. Those present later described a sensation of being pulled apart, their thoughts unraveling, their identities dissolving. The chanting, once unified, fractured into chaotic murmurs as some began muttering in voices not their own. One veteran was said to laugh uncontrollably, a high-pitched cackle that echoed off the walls, while another wept as though mourning someone long dead. The officiant pressed on, his voice louder than all the rest, calling for Kyojin no Kami to appear. And then, whether through the mirror, through the smoke, or from within their own minds, it answered. Accounts diverge wildly here, but a common thread runs through them, an overwhelming presence, something vast and indifferent, pressing against their world from the other side. Some describe it as a storm of eyes blinking in unison, others as a mass of writhing shadows, others still as a deafening silence that screamed louder than any sound. One scholar wrote in his notes, later found abandoned, "It is not a god. It is a fracture, a hunger. To see it is to be seen. To be seen is to be undone." His handwriting deteriorated into illegible scratches after this line. The climax of the ritual shattered what little order remained. The mirror, overwhelmed by blood, smoke, and chant, cracked with a sound like thunder, though no storm touched the mountain that night. The candles extinguished all at once, plunging the chamber into darkness. In that darkness, the men of the Kurozukai lost themselves completely. Some clawed at their own faces, as though trying to peel away their skin. Others collapsed into catatonia, eyes staring at nothing. A few, consumed by frenzy, attacked each other, their screams carrying into the forest. By dawn, the ritual was over. The shrine was a ruin of broken wood, overturned lanterns, and bloodstains. The officiant was gone. Whether dead, fled, or consumed, no one could say. Of the participants, a handful stumbled into nearby villages in the days that followed, incoherent and raving. They spoke of gates and eyes, of laughter that never ceased, of a darkness that had entered their veins. Others were never seen again. The villagers who found them whispered that they carried a curse, that madness itself had taken root in their minds. Families disowned them, doctors locked them in asylums, and scholars dismissed their accounts as hallucination. Yet for the survivors, the experience was undeniable. The night of the ritual was not merely failure, it was transformation. They had opened something, even if only for an instant, and in that instant their lives were permanently broken. The Kurozukai ceased to exist as an organized group after that night, but the legacy of the ritual lingered, spreading like cracks in glass through those who survived. The shrine itself was abandoned, its location gradually forgotten, its story carried only in whispers. But for those who lived through that night, the ritual never ended. They carried it within them, replayed endlessly in visions, dreams, and nightmares. Some killed themselves to escape it. Others embraced their madness, believing it proof that they had touched something greater. In either case, the night of the ritual had achieved exactly what the society had set out to do. It had broken the boundary between man and the abyss. And once broken, such boundaries can never truly be restored. When the smoke cleared and the broken shrine lay silent in the mountains, only a handful of men from the Kurozukai staggered back into the world of the living. Their faces were pale, eyes sunken and unfocused, their bodies trembling as though frostbitten. Villagers who saw them first mistook them for plague victims. They spoke in jumbled fragments, half-words, and delirious whispers. Some laughed when asked their names, others burst into tears without cause. What they carried back with them was not merely trauma, it was something that seemed to eat away at their sanity, as though the ritual had left an indelible stain. The first survivor to emerge appeared 2 days after the ritual. He stumbled into a farming village at the base of the mountains, his robe shredded, feet bare and bleeding. Witnesses recalled that he muttered a single phrase over and over, "It opened, it opened, it opened." When questioned, he clawed at his own throat until blood trickled from his neck. The villagers restrained him and carried him to the local temple, but he continued to mutter for hours until he fell silent, eyes wide and unblinking. He never recovered speech. In the weeks that followed, more survivors appeared, though never together. Each seemed disconnected from reality in ways unique yet hauntingly similar. One, a scholar who had been known for his precision and calm intellect, was found scribbling strange diagrams on the walls of an inn where he had sought shelter. Circles within circles, jagged lines intersecting like broken spiderwebs, and in the center of each drawing, a single staring eye. He refused food, refused water, and when innkeepers begged him to explain, he whispered, "It sees me when I close my eyes. I cannot sleep. I cannot dream." He was later taken to Kyoto's newly established psychiatric ward, where he died after tearing his fingernails down to the bone in a desperate attempt to gouge out his own vision. Another survivor, a former soldier, returned to his family in the countryside. At first, they believed he had escaped unscathed. He greeted his wife and children, he ate and slept. But within days, his demeanor shifted. He began waking in the night, screaming at shadows in the corners of the room. He claimed the darkness moved, that figures watched from the edges. Neighbors heard him shouting threats at empty air. His wife reported that he would stand outside in the rain for hours, staring upward, repeating, "It will descend again. It always descends." He was eventually tied down by relatives for his own safety, but in his final frenzy he bit clean through his tongue. His blood choked him before morning. The asylum records from 1905 and 1906 tell more of the story. In these fragile documents, yellowed, torn, and written in fading ink, we see how Japanese doctors struggled to explain what they called ritual-induced hysteria. At least 7 men connected to the Kurozukai were admitted to asylums across the country in the aftermath. Doctors described their conditions with clinical detachment, persistent hallucinations of eyes and mouths, violent self-harm urges, fixation upon circular patterns, compulsive chanting of non-Japanese syllables. Though medicine at the time lacked the vocabulary we use today, it is clear that these men were profoundly disturbed. Some of the case files, however, suggest that the doctors themselves were unsettled. One physician wrote, "Patients exhibit no consistent physical illness. Yet their descriptions align with disturbing similarity, always a presence, always the sensation of being observed, always the insistence that their thoughts no longer belong to them." Though these cases are scattered across regions, their testimony reads as though dictated by a single author. The implication was chilling, that whatever had touched them at the ritual, it had imprinted itself identically upon their minds. There are rumors, too, of survivors who did not seek treatment but vanished into obscurity. A few are said to have fled into the mountains, joining hermit sects or wandering as madmen along riverbanks. Farmers spoke of ragged figures who muttered curses into the soil, who laughed at funerals, who stood in silence during storms with arms outstretched as though welcoming the lightning. These sightings faded over the years, but the whispers remained. The Kurozukai had birthed not disciples, but ghosts in human flesh. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from a man whose writings survived long after his death. He was a minor nobleman, educated and articulate, and unlike most survivors he retained enough clarity to document his unraveling. His journal, discovered decades later in a locked chest, describes in painstaking detail the aftermath of the ritual. He wrote of hearing whispers that did not originate from his own mind, of dreams in which he walked endless corridors lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a version of himself with eyes missing. In one entry, he confessed, "I feel myself thinning, as though my body is merely a shell stretched over a deeper abyss. I no longer know where I end and the shadow begins." His final entry ended abruptly mid-sentence, the ink trailing into a jagged line. He hanged himself soon after. The madness of these men rippled outward, touching not just their lives but those of their families and communities. Wives were left widowed, children orphaned, entire households tainted by association. Some villagers refused to bury the dead survivors in local cemeteries, fearing their souls had been permanently corrupted. In one case, a body was burned outside the village limits against Buddhist custom, the ashes scattered so no shrine could be built. These acts of rejection reveal how deeply the fear spread. Madness was not just seen as an illness but as contagion, a curse that might leap from one person to another. What makes these accounts especially chilling is the consistency of imagery. Whether raving in the streets, scribbling in asylums, or writing in journals, survivors returned again and again to the same motifs: eyes watching from the void, voices echoing in dreams, a sense of being followed by something vast and cold. Was this simply a shared delusion, a product of suggestion amplified by ritual and fasting? Or did they truly glimpse something beyond the ordinary spectrum of human experience? The line between psychological trauma and supernatural intrusion blurs in their stories, leaving us to wonder whether their madness was internal or imposed. By 1907, the survivors had all but vanished from official records. Some had died violently, others slipped into obscurity, and those who remained institutionalized were eventually reduced to case numbers in forgotten hospital ledgers. Yet their legacy persisted. Local rumors of the cursed men spread like wildfire. Children were warned not to stray near abandoned shrines, lest they bring the same madness home. Folktales sprouted from the ashes of fact, portraying the Kurozukai survivors as cursed wanderers who brought storms and misfortune wherever they stepped. For historians and researchers today, the survivors' descent into madness stands as the most compelling evidence of the ritual's power. Even if one dismisses the supernatural entirely, there is no denying that something extraordinary occurred that night, something potent enough to fracture the minds of every man who walked away alive. Whether through suggestion, group hysteria, exposure to toxins, or contact with an unknown phenomenon, the result was the same: permanent psychological ruin. And so the men who had once sought power, who had hoped to command spirits and shape destiny, became instead warnings carved into history. They were living proof that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. That some knowledge, once glimpsed, cannot be forgotten. That sometimes, to look into the abyss is not to conquer it, but to invite it inside. If the survivors carried madness in their minds, the object at the heart of the ritual carried something far more enduring. The blackened mirror, shattered during the climax of that night, did not simply vanish into obscurity. Pieces of it remained, scattered among the ruins of the shrine. And it is in these fragments that the story takes on an even more sinister weight. For while men can die, and memories can fade, objects endure. And this mirror became a vessel of legend, whispered about as if it still pulsed with the darkness it had once reflected. The origins of the mirror were already clouded in myth even before the ritual. The Kurozukai claimed it had been discovered in a ruined temple in the mountains, half buried beneath collapsed beams. Some believed it was a relic of Shugendo ascetics who had used it for scrying centuries earlier. Others whispered it was far older, that it predated Buddhism in Japan, a cursed artifact left behind by forgotten rites of sun and shadow. Its surface was not polished like ordinary bronze mirrors, nor decorated with the intricate symbols of Shinto craftsmanship. Instead, it was black as obsidian, as though it had absorbed centuries of smoke and blood. Those who looked into it for too long reported a strange distortion. Their reflections shifted, faces lengthened, eyes flickered with movements not their own. When the mirror cracked on that fateful night, its shards were said to scatter across the shrine floor. Some pieces were pocketed by members of the Kurozukai before they fled into the darkness, while others lay forgotten amid the blood and ash. Local villagers, drawn by curiosity in the days after, claimed to have seen glints of black glass among the rubble, though few dared to touch them. One story tells of a farmer's son who carried home a shard the size of his palm. Within days, he became withdrawn, sitting for hours staring into the fragment. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and finally was found dead in the fields, his body rigid, his eyes wide open, reflecting the shard's black sheen. His family buried the fragment with him, but some say the grave never grew grass again. By the following year, the shrine was abandoned completely, its timbers collapsing into rot. But the mirror's pieces travelled further. Rumours surfaced of a Kyoto scholar who obtained a fragment through back channels, hoping to study it as an ethnographic curiosity. He placed it on his desk, among stacks of books and scrolls. Within weeks, he wrote to a colleague describing recurring nightmares, corridors lined with mirrors, each one reflecting him at different ages, some already dead. His final letter ended abruptly, reporting that he had seen his own reflection smile when he had not. Days later, he was found hanging from the beams of his study, the shard lying beneath him, cracked anew. His colleagues quietly disposed of the fragment, though where it was taken remains a mystery. What makes the mirror so haunting is not just the individual tragedies tied to its shards, but the symbolism it carried. In Shinto tradition, mirrors are sacred objects, tools for truth and clarity. The Yata no Kagami, one of Japan's 3 imperial regalia, is itself a mirror said to embody honesty and divine light. To corrupt such a symbol, to wield a mirror not as revelation but as gateway to darkness, was a profound blasphemy. The black mirror was the inversion of divinity. Instead of revealing truth, it concealed it. Instead of reflecting humanity, it distorted it. In this sense, it became more than an artifact. It became an anti-symbol, a perverse inversion of Japan's spiritual core. Even decades later, stories of the mirror's curse resurfaced. In the 1930s, as Japan plunged into militarism and secret societies thrived once more, an officer in the Imperial Army reportedly acquired what he believed was a shard from the 1905 ritual. He kept it in a lacquered box, believing it would lend him strength in battle. According to whispers among his men, he became increasingly paranoid, convinced his soldiers were plotting against him. He executed 2 of them on suspicion of betrayal, only for evidence later to prove their innocence. The officer himself was eventually killed during a skirmish in China, but when his belongings were recovered, the lacquer box was empty. Where the shards are now remains unknown. Some folklorists speculate that they were buried in unmarked graves or thrown into rivers to rid the land of their influence. Others claim they remain hidden in private collections, passed quietly from hand to hand among those obsessed with the occult. And still others believe they were reassembled, pieced back together in secret, the mirror waiting silently in some forgotten temple for the next summoning. Yet perhaps the most disturbing possibility is not that the mirror still exists, but that it never truly mattered whether it did. The ritual's power may not have come from the object itself but from the belief invested in it, the collective will of the Kurozukai, their desperation, and their madness. If that is true, then the mirror was only ever a vessel. And a vessel, once emptied, can always be filled again. This raises unsettling questions. If one such mirror could be used to open a door, how many others might lie hidden in Japan's countless shrines and ruins? How many relics of forgotten sects, warped by centuries of ritual, are waiting to be rediscovered? And more importantly, if such a ritual could be attempted once, what prevents it from being attempted again? The story of the mirror is not just about an object. It is about how symbols hold power, how they can inspire devotion, fear, and even madness. The Kurozukai believed the mirror would show them the divine. Instead, it reflected back their own darkness, magnified 100-fold. And in doing so, it cursed not just those who touched it, but all who heard its story. For once an object becomes a symbol of horror, it no longer needs to exist physically. The idea of it is enough to haunt generations. The blackened mirror was more than glass and metal. It was a reminder that objects can carry the weight of human obsession, that belief itself can make them dangerous. And as long as its legend endures, so too does the curse it left behind. When the madness of the Kurozukai survivors began to seep into the villages, when whispers of cursed men and shattered mirrors reached the edges of Kyoto, the authorities could no longer ignore what had happened. Yet the official response was not to investigate, not to confront, but to silence. In the Japan of 1905, national pride was everything. The country had just stunned the world by defeating Russia, stepping into the global stage as a modern power. To admit that madness and occultism festered in its shadows was unthinkable. And so the story of the ritual was buried beneath the machinery of the state. Police reports from the region contain only vague references to disturbances in the mountains that summer. Local officers were dispatched to investigate, but what they found, or what they chose to admit finding, was carefully sanitized. The ruined shrine was logged as abandoned, the bodies of any dead participants described simply as vagrants. There was no mention of chanting, no mention of mirrors, no mention of the survivors who clawed at their own eyes. Witness statements from villagers were dismissed as superstition, attributed to hysteria or rumor. Behind closed doors, however, there are indications that the government took the matter more seriously. The Home Ministry, which oversaw religious organizations, had long feared the rise of unsanctioned cults. The Kurozukai represented exactly the kind of group they wanted erased: secretive, nationalist, mystical, and uncontrollable. Files suggest that the surviving members who had not succumbed to madness were quietly detained. Some were committed to psychiatric wards under false names, their existence erased from family registers. Others simply disappeared. Whether executed, relocated, or absorbed into other organizations, their fates remain uncertain. The cover-up was not only about suppressing panic, it was about protecting the narrative of progress. Japan in 1905 wanted to present itself as a rational, modern state, not a land still haunted by ghosts. To acknowledge that men had torn themselves apart in the name of forbidden rituals would have undermined that image. Newspapers that attempted to publish stories about the strange events in the mountains were swiftly censored. Editors were warned, articles pulled, and rumors replaced with stories of patriotic heroes and industrial triumphs. But silence breeds questions, and in the absence of official truth, whispers flourished. In villages near the mountains, people told their own versions of the events. Some said the government burned the shrine to the ground to purify it, scattering salt over the ruins. Others believed officials carried away the mirror shards, storing them in vaults deep within Tokyo for study or for use. Still others claimed the army itself had sponsored the ritual, hoping to harness supernatural power as a weapon of war, and that the Kurozukai were nothing more than pawns in a failed experiment. None of these stories could be proven, but all carried the same message. The state had secrets, and it was willing to bury the truth under layers of silence. What makes the cover-up especially unsettling is how thorough it was. By the 1920s, records of the Kurozukai had all but vanished from official archives. Historians searching through temple registries, police reports, and medical documents find only fragments: a patient with ritual hysteria, a police note on disturbances in the province, an unsigned letter referencing a dangerous sect. The society's name itself appears less and less frequently, until it is reduced to nothing but rumor. It is as if someone deliberately erased their presence from history. And yet, Despite the silence, small cracks remain. In private collections, scholars have uncovered correspondence between minor officials, letters written in hurried hands warning of contamination and unacceptable practices. In one such letter, an official laments, "The madness spreads even in silence. We may lock them away, but the shadows they carried linger still." Another fragment, unsigned and undated, references the mirror directly. The object must not be spoken of. It is already too late to contain what it reflected. These scattered hints suggest that the authorities may have feared the mirror's curse just as much as the villagers did. For the families of the participants, the cover-up was devastating. Wives who lost husbands were given no explanations, no bodies to bury. Children grew up hearing rumors about their fathers, whispers of madness, of betrayal, of curses, but no official acknowledgement. Entire bloodlines were stained by association, some changing their names to escape the shadow of the ritual. The silence was not protection. It was another kind of curse, one that erased the possibility of closure. By smothering the story, the state hoped to extinguish it. But as history shows, suppressed truths rarely vanish. Instead, they transform into something darker, more compelling. What the government silenced in 1905 became legend in the decades that followed. A tale of cursed men, forbidden mirrors, and a ritual that opened a door best left closed. And in that transformation, the state lost control of the narrative. For while official records may have buried the facts, folklore gave them new life. In the end, the cover-up ensured that the Kurozukai ritual would never be remembered as a mistake or a footnote. It became instead a forbidden story, a piece of whispered history too dangerous to write down. And sometimes, it is the stories we are not allowed to hear that echo the loudest. When the authorities attempted to bury the story of the Kurozukai, they underestimated the power of whispers. In the mountains and villages near Kyoto, people refused to forget. They turned fragments of horror into tales, shaping them into something that could be told around firesides, in hushed tones, or in warnings to children. What officials tried to silence became folklore, and folklore often travels further than truth. At first, the stories were simple retellings. Farmers spoke of the night when the mountains trembled with chanting, when strange lights flickered through the trees, and when a handful of broken men staggered back to civilization with eyes wild and hands bleeding. They said the gods had punished arrogance, that men who sought forbidden knowledge had been cursed. Over time, however, the tale fractured into many versions. In one, the survivors were not men at all but hollow shells, puppets animated by spirits from beyond the mirror. In another, the mirror itself was alive, feeding on madness, its shards spreading evil wherever they were carried. The details changed, but the core remained. A ritual had gone wrong, and its shadow lingered. Among the villagers, the story became a warning to children. They were told never to stare too long into mirrors at night, for if they did, they might see more than their reflection. "The face you see is not your own," elders would whisper. "It is waiting for you to trade places." Such sayings, while dismissed as superstition by city folk, created a culture of quiet fear around reflective surfaces. In some households, mirrors were covered during storms or left broken rather than repaired, as if to prevent the cursed fragments from reassembling themselves. The legend of the Kurozukai also began to attract the attention of outsiders, scholars, occultists, and thrill-seekers who craved forbidden knowledge. By the 1910s, whispers of the ritual had spread beyond local folklore and into esoteric circles in Tokyo and Osaka. Amateur mystics and secret societies passed around embellished accounts of the mirror of madness. Some believed it was connected to older Shinto myths of kagami, sacred mirrors that acted as vessels for divine power. Others tied it to Buddhist teachings about illusions, arguing that the mirror had shown not madness but the raw truth of existence, too overwhelming for mortal minds to withstand. This fascination created a strange divide. For the villagers, the story was a curse to be avoided, while for the educated elite, it was an enigma to be pursued. Rumors surfaced of students sneaking into abandoned shrines with fragments of polished glass, attempting to recreate the ritual in miniature. Occult journals printed cryptic references to the mirror beyond light, often with warnings that no experiment should be attempted. Still, the idea of forbidden knowledge proved irresistible. The more the government tried to erase the Kurozukai, the more alluring they became to those who sought hidden truths. Folklore also linked the ritual to unexplained tragedies. When a farmer hanged himself without cause, villagers whispered that he had seen the mirror in a dream. When a young woman drowned in a river, people said she had glimpsed her reflection too long, losing herself to the other side. Over the years, accidents, suicides, and disappearances were woven into the expanding tapestry of the legend. Each new misfortune was folded into the curse's legacy, strengthening the sense that the Kurozukai had unleashed something that could not be contained. By the 1920s, the story had spread beyond Japan. Western travelers, fascinated by tales of the exotic and the occult, carried fragments of the legend back to Europe. A British spiritualist magazine published an article on the Japanese mirror that shows madness, though its details were exaggerated and distorted beyond recognition. In Paris, members of occult salons whispered about it as if it were a cousin to their own experiments with seances and automatic writing. In this way, what began as a tragedy in the mountains of Kyoto became part of a global network of ghost stories and occult lore. Yet even as the tale spread, it never lost its sharp edge. Unlike many legends that become softened by time, the Kurozukai story retained a sense of danger. People did not tell it for amusement, they told it as a warning. The fear was not just of madness or death but of knowledge itself, the idea that there were truths so corrosive that to glimpse them would shatter the mind. It became a parable about hubris, about the cost of trying to see too much, about the line between curiosity and damnation. In some versions of the story, the ritual was not a failure but a success. The participants had not gone mad but had seen something beyond the human realm, something so profound that their minds could not return unchanged. This interpretation appealed especially to the more esoteric believers, who claimed that madness was not a curse but a gateway. To them, the survivors of the ritual were visionaries, sacrificed to glimpse the divine. But for the villagers who saw only broken men wandering the fields, there was no divinity, only horror. The persistence of these tales demonstrates how folklore functions as both memory and resistance. Where official records erased, stories remembered. Where the government silenced, whispers preserved. In the end, it was not the archives that carried the Kurozukai into the future but the human voice, passing the tale from parent to child, scholar to student, believer to skeptic. That is why, more than a century later, the story has not died. For some, it remains a ghost story, told to frighten children. For others, it is an occult mystery, a puzzle still waiting to be solved. But in every telling, the same unease lingers, that somewhere in the mountains of Kyoto, a mirror once reflected more than it should, and that its shadow still waits, just beyond the surface of the glass. By the time the 1930s arrived, Japan had transformed once again. The empire's ambitions had grown, pushing it toward expansion across Asia. The nation marched forward with military discipline, factories roared with industry, and schools instilled a loyalty to emperor and country above all else. On the surface, the old superstitions of mountain villages seemed far away, relics of a fading past. Yet the story of the Kurozukai refused to vanish. Like a stubborn shadow, it reappeared in unexpected corners of modern life, surfacing in whispers among soldiers, patients in psychiatric wards, and even in the academic journals of those studying the limits of the human mind. One of the first places the legend resurfaced was in the Japanese military. As the nation prepared for war in the 1930s, officers drilled soldiers in discipline and obedience. Yet in barracks and campfires, men told each other stories meant to frighten, distract, or remind them of unseen dangers. Among these, the tale of the mirror ritual reappeared, reshaped to fit the fears of a new age. Some soldiers claimed that those who gazed into polished bayonets during moonless nights risked summoning the same madness that had cursed the Kurozukai. Others whispered that captured enemies could be driven insane by forcing them to stare into a cursed mirror said to be kept hidden in a military archive. Whether these accounts were based on real objects or simply retellings of old folklore, the effect was the same. The story became a cautionary tale within the army, reinforcing the idea that some powers were too dangerous to be controlled. At the same time, Japan's growing interest in psychology gave the story a new kind of attention. Doctors in Tokyo and Osaka began encountering patients who described visions of mirrors swallowing their reflections or voices calling from the other side of the glass. These patients often spoke of the Kurozukai by name, even when they had no direct connection to the mountain villages. For psychiatrists, the legend became an example of what they called cultural madness, a condition shaped by folklore, where fear of a story could manifest in real psychological symptoms. Some doctors dismissed it as hysteria, others as superstition, but a few suggested something more disturbing, that the ritual itself might have planted a seed of collective trauma, spreading far beyond its original participants. World War II amplified these whispers. As bombs fell on cities and soldiers faced unimaginable horrors, stories of cursed visions became more common. Survivors of air raids sometimes claim to see faces staring back at them from shattered glass, as though the dead were trapped in the reflections. Soldiers returning from battle reported dreams of a mirror framed in fire, always showing them distorted versions of themselves. These accounts blurred the line between trauma and legend, between psychological scars and something older, darker, that had followed Japan into the modern age. In the post-war years, when Japan rebuilt itself under American occupation, the story of the Kurozukai shifted yet again. During the 1950s and 1960s, as psychiatry and psychology grew more advanced, academics revisited the legend in papers and conferences. Some framed it as a case study of mass hysteria. Others compared it to Western accounts of seances gone wrong or European tales of cursed relics. A few bold researchers even suggested that the ritual might have been an early experiment in altered states of consciousness, an attempt to induce visions or hallucinations using sensory overload, chanting, and mirrors. Whether their conclusions were scientific or speculative, they kept the story alive, ensuring that the ritual was not entirely forgotten. At the same time, the legend began to merge with modern urban myths. In the 1970s and 1980s, Japanese schoolchildren dared each other to perform mirror games late at night. Some called it Kagami no Oni, or the mirror demon, a ritual where one stared into the mirror and chanted certain words, risking the appearance of a reflection that moved on its own. These playground dares bore uncanny resemblance to Western tales like Bloody Mary, but many claim their roots lay in the old Kurozukai story. Teachers dismissed the rituals as childish games, but every few years, a newspaper reported a student collapsing in fear, convinced they had seen something in the glass that wasn't supposed to be there. By the 1990s, the legend had taken on yet another life through media. Horror films, manga, and novels borrowed from the imagery of cursed mirrors, often without naming the Kurozukai directly. Audiences were drawn to the unsettling idea that an ordinary object, a mirror, something present in every home, could be a doorway to madness. These stories may have been fictional, but they carried echoes of the original ritual, reshaped to fit modern fears. In an age of rapid technological change, the mirror symbolism remained hauntingly relevant, a surface that reflects reality, yet always with the possibility of revealing something else, something wrong. Today, the echoes of the ritual are still felt. Psychologists sometimes cite the Kurozukai when discussing mirror self-misidentification, a rare condition where patients fail to recognize themselves in reflections. Folklorists continue to track the evolution of the tale, tracing how a local tragedy in 1905 became a nationwide legend. And online forums dedicated to the paranormal keep the story alive, sharing grainy photographs of supposed cursed mirrors and retelling the story of the 13 men who opened a door they could not close. The persistence of these echoes suggests something deeper than superstition. Whether one believes the Kurozukai actually summoned a supernatural force or views it as a tragic episode of mass psychosis, its legacy demonstrates the enduring power of forbidden knowledge. Once an idea enters human imagination, that a mirror can be more than glass, that it can reflect something alien, it cannot be easily erased. It finds new shapes, new contexts, and new ways to haunt. The door to madness, once opened, does not close quietly. It lingers in memory, in story, and in every nervous glance we cast into our own reflection, wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, something might one day look back.